Hi everybody, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and this week's contract tip has to do with the due diligence period in our real estate contracts here in Georgia. So this time frame, depending on which contract forms you're using, if you're using the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors contracts, it is referred to as the due diligence period. If you are using the RE forms contract, this time frame is referred to as the buyer's right to terminate period. Regardless of which set of contracts you're using and what it's called, conceptually and contractually, it is the same concept and the same thing per the buyer and the seller with respect to the contract. So what is it? That time frame is the period within which the buyer has to decide, are they going to proceed with the contract or are they going to terminate? In essence, it creates an option contract for the buyer for that time frame. If the buyer chooses to terminate prior to 11:59 p.m. at night, the number of days that the buyer and the seller negotiated in filling out that contract, then the buyer terminates. They don't even need a reason. The buyer can terminate for any reason. And on the form, the termination form, all you fill in is termination within due diligence period. You don't need to put an explanation at all. And within that time frame, the buyer will get their earnest money back because they are terminating within that agreed upon contingency. So again, it is an option contract for the buyer. Simply the option is, are they going to proceed or are they not going to proceed? So what happens? So during this due diligence period or buyer's right to terminate period, the buyer needs to do whatever is required to make the buyer completely satisfied that they are going to proceed with the contract or terminate, their choice. But that is the time frame within which to make themselves satisfied and do what they need to do to determine how they are going to proceed. So the buyer does have reasonable access to the property within this time frame for whatever inspections or the buyer wants to have done. For example, the buyer may have an independent home inspector come in during that time frame. The buyer may have a roof inspector. The buyer may have a foundation inspector. The buyer may have a termite inspector come. The buyer may simply bring family or friends or loved ones to come and look at the property. The buyer can just, whatever the buyer needs to do is the time frame within which the buyer can do that. And the buyer does have reasonable access to inspect the property, whether that means just viewing the property or having inspections done. The buyer's not required to have inspections done, but within this time frame is what the buyer can do. Now, if the buyer is going to have the property inspected by a variety of people or whomever, make sure that as the buyer's agent that you give, if the property's occupied, make sure you give a courtesy call to the listing agent to schedule a time for these inspections to occur. With a vacant property, those timeframes typically are a little bit easier, but make sure you get permission from the listing agent to access the property. And if you are not going to be present, absolutely make sure that that is okay with the listing agent and the seller, because it is still someone else's property, and those permissions need to be in place. So what can happen? One of three things can happen during this time frame. Either the buyer may attempt to negotiate any repairs or items that the buyer wishes the seller to address, or change the price based on what the buyer finds with the property. The buyer may simply terminate the contract and get their earnest money back, or the buyer may proceed with the purchase of the property, knowing that from that point on, it is an as-is contract. So where is all of this explained in the actual contracts? So in the GAR contract form, in the GAR purchase and sale agreement F20, on paragraph A9, it says inspection and due diligence. Paragraph 9A, A9A, it says due diligence period. Property is being sold subject to a due diligence period of blank number of days from the binding agreement date. And make sure that the buyer and the seller negotiate an adequate time frame in that day, in that time frame, for the buyer to do what they need to be satisfied with the property. Then it says option payment for due diligence period. In consideration of seller granting buyer the option to terminate the agreement, that's all it is, an option to terminate the agreement, the buyer, number one, has paid the seller $10 in non-refundable option money, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged. The $10 doesn't change hands. You just need consideration for an enforceable contract, and that's the consideration because of this mini option contract within the broader context of the rest of the terms of the purchase and sale agreement that the buyer and seller have negotiated. Then there is number two, there is an additional option money. Buyer shall pay to seller additional option money of X number of dollars by check or wire transfer of immediately available funds, either as of the offer date or binding agreement date. That goes directly to the seller and is non-refundable. We are not seeing a lot of additional option money for that due diligence option contract in the contracts in a couple of years. I haven't seen any option money at all. So then the due diligence period, as I've explained it in this video, is further explained in the contract, in the GAR contract, on paragraph B9. It goes on to describe the right to inspect the property, that the buyer or buyer's representatives have the right to go in and inspect the property, and the buyer has the duty to inspect the neighborhood, so forth and so on. And then it says, paragraph B9D, property sold as is unless the agreement is subject to due diligence period. Unless the property is being sold subject to a due diligence period referenced herein, the property is sold as is with all faults. The inclusion of a due diligence period shall, A, during its term make this agreement an option contract in which the buyer may decide to proceed or not proceed with the purchase of the property and for any reason, and B, an acknowledgement by the seller and the buyer has paid separate valuable consideration for $10 for granting this option. Purpose of the due diligence period. During the due diligence period, the buyer shall determine whether or not to exercise the buyer's option to proceed or not proceed with the purchase of the property. If the buyer has any concerns, the buyer may, during this time frame, seek to negotiate an amendment to address these concerns with the seller. The seller is not obligated to address anything the buyer asks for. And 3, notice of decision not to proceed. The buyer shall have elected to exercise the buyer's option to purchase unless prior to the expiration of this time frame, the buyer notifies the seller in writing of the decision not to proceed with the contract and terminate prior to the end of the due diligence period. If not, the buyer shall have accepted the property as is, subject to the terms of the agreement, and buyer shall no longer have any right to terminate this agreement based on this due diligence period. That's where it talks about it in the GAR contract. In the RE forms contract, in the actual purchase and sale agreement, RE100, contract for purchase and sale of residential real property, it is in paragraph 6.1 under contingencies. Contingencies. In consideration of the covenants contained herein, good and valuable consideration, the receipt and sufficiency whereof is hereby acknowledged. The seller grants the buyer the following contingencies as the same are defined in the standard terms. 6.1, buyer's general right to terminate. This contingency shall expire at 11:59 p.m. on the day that is blank number of days from the acceptance date. In consideration of the seller granting the buyer's general right to terminate this contract, buyer has paid the seller $10 in non-refundable option money, the receipt and sufficiency of which is hereby acknowledged. Again, that's just for consideration for this mini option contract. The $10 never exchanges hands. That's why it says receipt and sufficiency is hereby acknowledged. Then that is further explained in the RE forms standard terms, which is RE1. And as you know, as a maximum one agent, it is our policy that if you go binding on an RE forms contract, you absolutely download and reference and attach the standard terms as part of the contract, and you reference them as an exhibit. So In the RE forms paragraph 6.1, it describes what this is to the buyer and the seller. Buyer's right to terminate. This contingency shall only be granted by the seller if the appropriate box related thereto is checked within the body of the contract and is hereby selected. If the contingency is not selected, then it is not part of the contract. Subject to any expiration date expressed in writing in the contract, the buyer's general right to terminate is defined as seller's grant to buyer of the right to terminate the contract by delivering written notice to the seller and receiving a full refund of earnest money for any reason whatsoever. Buyer shall also have the right, but not the obligation, prior to the expiration of this contingency, to propose to the seller an amendment to the contract addressing any concerns that the buyer may have regarding the property. The seller has no obligation to accept the amendment or address any of the concerns. If the seller fails to accept the buyer's proposal prior to the expiration of this contingency, the buyer shall have the option either to terminate or to proceed. If they proceed, the buyer is proceeding with an as-is contract. The property is being sold as is. If the seller does not receive timely notice prior to the expiration of this time frame that the buyer is terminating, then this contingency is waived and the buyer is proceeding as is. If the buyer does terminate within this time frame, buyer's right to terminate time frame, the buyer shall be refunded all the earnest money. And again, you don't even need a reason. The buyer can simply terminate for whatever reason. And it doesn't have to be based on anything the buyer found with the property. The buyer can simply change their mind. Somebody in the buyer's life cannot like the property. The buyer can get a job transfer, whatever. There doesn't even need to be a reason, and the buyer is protected within this option time frame. So if a buyer does have the property inspected and does find some concerns that they want the seller to address, how do you proceed? Well, in the GAR contract, there is an amendment F107, amendment to address concerns with the property. In the RE forms, it is RE262, amendment during the buyer's right to terminate period. So those are the appropriate amendments to use within this time frame for the buyer to contact the seller to negotiate if any concerns that the buyer wants the seller to address with the property. Again, the seller is not obligated to accept them. You negotiate through these items or price change or anything like that. But all of this must be negotiated for the buyer to decide, are they proceeding or are they terminating? All of this must be negotiated prior to the end of the due diligence period, which was originally negotiated in the contract. So do not get confused. Many buyers do have the property inspected during this time frame, but it is not an inspection period. It is simply an option. It is simply a due diligence buyer's right to terminate period. In the GAR forms, there is a form F100, amendment to remove inspection contingency. Do not get confused. That is not an appropriate amendment to use if the contract is subject to due diligence or buyer's right to terminate. That amendment is only to be used if you made the contract subject to property sold with right to request repairs exhibit, which is another GAR exhibit, the GAR F129, property sold with right to request repairs exhibit. And for you agents that have been practicing over 10, 12 years, you will remember that prior to the due diligence paragraph within our contracts, all the properties were sold subject to an inspection period. That's what that whole thing is. So if you are going to do that, you need to go look at those forms, and that exhibit must be included up front when negotiating the original contract. It is not a due diligence period. It doesn't create an option period. It doesn't give the buyer any rights to terminate the contract and get the earnest money back for any reason. So again, just don't get confused with that GAR amendment when the contract is subject to due diligence. And so how do you extend the due diligence time frame? There is no unilateral extension of the due diligence time frame. It is negotiated up front when the buyer and the seller negotiate the contract. If the parties do want to extend that due diligence time frame, there is a GAR form. If you're using the GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors contracts, it's F109, amendment to change the due diligence period. And if you are using the RE forms contract, you just use a general amendment REF 105 Amendment to Agreement. In order to extend the due diligence period, it is an amendment bilateral. The buyer and the seller must agree on that extension. If both parties do not agree, then that due diligence time frame expires at 11:59 p.m. at the number of days after the binding agreement date as negotiated in the original purchase and sale agreement. So I hope that explained what the due diligence period, buyer's right to terminate period is a little bit more. The reason I'm bringing it up is sometimes we have seen special stipulations in a contract that references buyer's inspection period or buyer to have something in the special stipulations referencing an inspection period. There is no inspection period referenced anywhere else in the contract, and the due diligence period is not an inspection period. It is a time frame within which a buyer may have the property inspected, but it is not. These contracts, if you're writing them as I've described, these contracts are subject to due diligence or buyer's right to terminate. They are not subject to any inspections. So be very careful of your terminology when it is not referenced elsewhere in the contract. It's completely meaningless if you mention something about buyer's inspection period shall be 14 days in a special stipulation. That has no bearing on the contract whatsoever. It doesn't reference the buyer's protection or rights to terminate or protection of earnest money or anything like that. So that is a totally meaningless special stipulation. Go back, make sure you read your contracts. Please take the contracts classes that we offer, and hope this video helped you a little bit. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.